of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this important encounter on human mobility, environment and climate change nexus, the University of the Philippines and the International Training Center for Authorities and Leaders, CIFAL Philippines, for this initiative on a key issue ahead of COP26. I would like to raise 3 points for us today. First, the facts and data we can rely on to assess the situation. Second, the policies framed at international level and action engaged by IOM. Third, how to go further. Data shows the urgency of addressing the links between migration, environment, and climate change. As we are all aware, environmental dynamics have long been a factor shaping migration. In the context of a changing environment, people engage in different forms of migration within their countries and across borders. This mobility spans the continuum from displacement to more voluntary forms of migration. Figures on current population movements show us that in 2020 alone, disasters accounted for more than 30 million new internal displacements in nearly 150 countries. And more than 98% of these movements were the result of weather-related hazards like storms and floods. Over 2/3 of these movements were recorded in Asia and the Pacific. Between 2008 and 2017, nearly 200 million people were displaced by sudden onset disasters in Asia and the Pacific. 5 countries accounted for more than 60% of the new internal displacement due to disasters in the world: China, Philippines, Bangladesh, India, and the United States. By the end of 2020, an estimated 7 million people in more than 100 countries were still living in displacement as a result of disasters, which might be beyond that a significant underestimate. Looking at the future, we also know that if no climate action is taken, by 2050 climate change impacts could lead to more than 143 million people moving out of their country, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America. Some might still react saying that these figures do not show the evidence and are more complex. We can somewhat agree with them. There is indeed little systematic collection of evidence on the outcomes of displacement and migration in the context of disasters and environmental change, including their social and economic costs for those on the move and their communities. But above all, despite the best efforts of the scientific community, as well as the humanitarian community, including IOM, the present reality of continuous disasters and adverse effects of climate change probably precedes now the scientific capacity to measure their present impacts. As a matter of fact, although sudden onset hazards such as floods, storms, earthquakes have always affected communities and societies, today climate and environmental change are making the impacts of those hazards more acute, threatening ecosystems all over the world. They are leading to loss and damage and will increasingly drive migration and displacement over the coming decades, thus profoundly reshaping contemporary migration patterns worldwide in diverse ways. Beyond sudden onset hazards, however, it is difficult to single out environmental events or processes as the sole or main factor triggering migration or displacement. Mobility decisions generally come from more complex processes at the individual or household level, mostly mediated by socio-economic and political factors as well. But if drivers for people moving are mixed, climate change definitely appears as a risk multiplier, which exacerbates other causes of voluntary migration. Given this context, the international community is starting to mobilize, or has started, to try to address this situation. Since 2015, significant progress has been made in integrating migration and environmental change and degradation into key international frameworks and commitments. As it is well known, the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, the 2015 Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Global Compact for Safe and Regular Migration adopted in 2018 include strong commitments by states to address the alarming progression of slow onset processes, the recurrence of sudden onset hazards, together with the challenges they pose in terms of migration management and ensuring people can move out of harm's way. Beyond these frameworks and commitments, we have come a long way in the past 5 years, as we now have even more instruments of cooperation, such as the UNFCCC Task Force on Displacement, the Platform Disaster Displacement, following the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, and whose work is very useful and encouraging. These frameworks and instruments pave a way forward for an integrated approach that spans preventive action, humanitarian responses, and long-term sustainable recovery and development. They also point to the need to take action at the local, national, and regional levels, and in particular within at-risk and affected communities, to avert, minimize, and address displacement and facilitate regular migration pathways in a changing climate. IOM, on its side, has developed a capacity to assert these situations, to prevent them, acting at different levels in an integrated approach to mobility, from preparedness to disaster response, and to address them in order to strengthen the resilience of the populations, whether at risk or already suffering of highly impacting climate change. This is in line with the IOM new strategy on migration, climate change, and the environment from 2021-2030. IOM is carrying out as well activities to address the human mobility dimensions of climate change and environmental degradation, and to support disaster risk reduction and resilience in numerous countries around the world. Working with nations of the Pacific, for example, we are breaking new ground in the development of a regional response to address protection gaps for communities that are at risk to climate change-related migration, displacement, and planned relocation. In the Philippines, we are helping to build on the existing evidence base on migration, climate change, and providing frameworks for in-depth policy research to help key stakeholders in continuing to develop migrant-centered policies and programs with the most recent and relevant information. In Thailand and Malaysia, we are beginning unique research exploring the role of international labor migration as an adaptation strategy to climate change, with a focus on the role of businesses, which are also critical actors in the discussion. However, we can and should do more. Given the present data and scientific evidence of the aggravating impacts of climate change on human mobility, and only by working together, we must step up our commitments and make a positive difference to the lives of displaced persons, migrants, and communities. We should raise our ambitions on managing migration in a changing climate at international level. The effective implementation of the 2018 Global Compact, the GCM, building upon the frameworks mentioned earlier, can offer states who suffer with climate impacts concrete solutions to manage migration. As to the UN network on migration, that was established to provide the whole UN system a wide support for the implementation, follow-up, and review of the Global Compact. And it has determined that climate change was a key priority by 2021. As the coordinator of this full network, I can say that IOM is totally committed to enhance its support to its work on climate change. So ahead of COP26, IOM would like to emphasize 4 priorities. First, the November conference, COP26, in Glasgow represents a key opportunity for us to integrate human mobility in climate change policies. We should strive for stronger commitment by the international community to include human mobility linked to climate change, now visible everywhere in the world, in the global climate negotiations, and importantly, national and regional policies adopted to address climate change, migration and displacement, including the implementation of the 2015 Paris Agreement. Second, we should as well work on the basis of all the scientific evidence recently produced and synthesized in the last IPCC report to insist on taking into account at the international level the necessity for more adaptation measures, which means adequate and predictable finance to prevent displacement and increase people's resilience. Third, we need to step up our support to the most vulnerable countries and people, such as women, children, indigenous people, to climate change impacts. This means translating global principles into tangible activities at the local, national, regional levels and support them by adequate and sustainable finance. This means as well calling for the need to take an integrated approach to adaptation and loss and damage measures. Fourth, last but not least, IOM is calling for global efforts to address climate migration and implement the Paris Agreement to be more inclusive of all public, private and civil society actors. This includes ensuring inclusive negotiation processes that listen to and effectively integrate migrants' voices. As a conclusion, as the world sets out the course for post-COVID-19 pandemic recovery, migration and displacement must remain fundamental considerations across all resilience building and adaptation efforts. IOM will continue to deliver support to its partner states and communities with an aim to meet our national, regional and global commitments for migrants, displaced populations and communities. Thank you very much for your attention.